Let me tell you about the day I accidentally became best friends with a creature that could probably eat a small moon. But first, let me paint you a picture of my life at what I lovingly call Hell University, also known as the Galactic University of Advanced Sciences. Picture this. You're the only human in a classroom full of beings that look like they escaped from a fever dream. There's Zeklin, who resembles a cross between a praying mantis and a philosophy professor, complete with 4 arms that never stop gesturing. Then there's Morthos, built like a walking boulder with eyes, who communicates primarily through what sounds like grinding concrete. And don't get me started on Pipara, whose idea of taking notes involves secreting some kind of bioluminescent ink from her fingertips. Yeah, it's exactly as gross as it sounds. I'm Jake Martinez, by the way, 22 years old, stubborn as a mule, and apparently the first human stupid enough to apply for the xenobiology program at the most prestigious university in the galaxy. My guidance counselor back on Earth had tried to talk me into accounting. Should have listened to her. The whole reason I'm here, freezing my butt off on a space station that orbits 3 different suns but somehow still feels like the inside of a refrigerator, is because I thought studying alien life would be fascinating. Turns out, it is fascinating. It's also terrifying, exhausting, and apparently designed to make me question every life choice I've ever made. But the real cherry on top of this cosmic disaster sundae is Professor Vextar. Imagine a 7-foot-tall lizard person with an attitude problem and a superiority complex the size of Jupiter. He's got scales that shimmer between purple and green depending on his mood, which seems to be permanently set to annoyed by human existence. His eyes are these unsettling yellow things that follow me around the classroom, like I'm some kind of fascinating bacteria he'd rather scrape off his shoe. From day one, Vextar made it crystal clear that he considered my presence in his advanced xenobiology class to be somewhere between an insult and a practical joke. Every question I asked was met with this condescending tilt of his reptilian head, and a response that usually started with, "Well, I suppose someone of your limited cognitive capacity might think that." Charming guy, really. The kind of professor who makes you wonder if maybe flipping burgers for the rest of your life wouldn't be so bad after all. The worst part is, I'm actually not doing that badly in the class. Sure, I can't regurgitate academic jargon like my classmates, and I definitely don't have their fancy biological adaptations or centuries of advanced civilization behind me. But I've got something they don't seem to have: common sense and a healthy dose of Midwestern stubbornness. While they're debating the theoretical implications of predator-prey relationships in 17-dimensional mathematical models, I'm the one pointing out that maybe we should consider why the creature actually behaves the way it does. Revolutionary concept, apparently. This drives Vextar absolutely insane. You can literally watch his scales shift to a darker shade of irritation every time I open my mouth. It's like he took my acceptance into his program as a personal affront to his academic reputation. Which brings us to today, and what I'm now referring to as the incident that changed everything. Though, at the time, I just thought it was going to be another Tuesday morning of trying not to fall asleep while Vextar droned on about classification systems I'll never remember. Little did I know, our dear professor had finally decided to do something about his human problem, and his solution was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Now, I should probably mention that Vextar isn't just your average pompous academic. No, he's got what you might call a hobby. See, most professors collect rare books or vintage wines. Vextar collects deadly predators from the galaxy's most dangerous worlds. Because apparently having a superiority complex isn't enough, you also need to prove you can tame things that could kill you, 17 different ways before breakfast. His office looks like a cross between a natural history museum and a horror movie set. Mounted heads, preserved specimens floating in jars of suspicious-looking liquid, and holographic displays showing creatures that would make a Tyrannosaurus Rex wet itself in fear. The guy's got issues, is what I'm saying. But his crown jewel, his pride and joy, his absolute favorite conversation starter at faculty parties, is something called a shadow maw. And before you ask, no, that's not a name designed to sound friendly and approachable. This thing comes from a delightful little vacation spot called Grim Holt, which the Galactic Tourism Board describes as a death world, where evolution gave up trying to create anything that wasn't specifically designed to murder you. According to the literature, which I'd been forced to read for our midterm, shadow maws are apex predators that combine the worst features of every nightmare you've ever had. They're roughly the size of a small shuttle, covered in what can only be described as weaponized tentacles, and possessed of an intelligence that borders on the malicious. Most civilizations classify them somewhere between natural disaster and minor apocalypse. The fact that Professor Vextar claimed to have domesticated one had made him something of a celebrity in academic circles. He'd written papers about it, given lectures, Probably had it printed on business cards, for all I know. So you can imagine my surprise when he strutted into class that Tuesday morning with what I can only describe as the expression of someone who'd just figured out how to solve all his problems with one brilliantly evil plan. "Class," he announced, his scales practically shimmering with self-satisfaction. "Today we're going to have a special demonstration, a practical examination of apex predator behavioral patterns and their relationship to the natural order of species hierarchy." Morthos made his usual grinding noise, which I'd learned to interpret as either deep thought or digestive distress. Pipara's bioluminescent notes started flickering more rapidly, which probably meant excitement or terror. With aliens, it's always hard to tell. Zeklin raised one of his forearms. "Professor, are we discussing theoretical models or observing recorded data?" Vextar's grin revealed far too many teeth for my comfort. "Oh, we're going to observe live specimens. You see, I've decided it's time for a more hands-on approach to education. Sometimes theory isn't enough to truly understand the fundamental principles of predatory dominance." That's when he looked directly at me, and I swear I could feel the temperature in the room drop about 10 degrees. His yellow eyes had this gleam in them that reminded me of every bad movie villain who'd ever said something like, "You'll never escape my ingenious trap," right before everything went horribly wrong. "I've arranged for a very special guest to join us today," he continued, still staring at me like I was a particularly interesting bug he was about to squash. "My personal companion, Nyx. She's a fully mature Shadow Maw, and I think you'll find her presence quite educational regarding the proper respect one should show to superior life forms." The classroom went dead silent, and I mean dead silent. Even the usual hum of the life support system seemed to quiet down, like the space station itself was holding its breath. Tipora's bioluminescent scribbling stopped completely. Morthos's grinding turned into what sounded distinctly like a whimper. Zeklin's forearms started making these nervous twitching motions that I'd never seen before. "Professor," Zeklin squeaked, his usual philosophical composure completely gone, "surely you don't mean to bring an actual Shadow Maw into the classroom? The safety protocols alone would require—" "Safety protocols are for species that need protection," Vextar interrupted smoothly. "Advanced beings learn to coexist with apex predators through understanding and proper respect for natural hierarchy. Some of us, of course, may find this lesson more challenging than others." And there it was. The whole elaborate setup was basically Vextar's way of saying, "Hey human, meet something that could turn you into a light snack, and let's see how superior you feel then." I had to admire the pettiness of it, really. Most professors would just fail you on a test or give you impossible assignments, but not our Vextar. He was going full supervillain, complete with bringing his pet death machine to class just to prove a point. What he didn't know, of course, is that I grew up on a farm in Kansas where my biggest childhood fear was my grandmother's rooster, Gerald, who had an attitude problem and a personal vendetta against anyone under the age of 12. Gerald had taught me an important life lesson. Sometimes the scariest-looking things are really just bullies looking for an easy target. I had a feeling Professor Vextar was about to learn that lesson himself. 20 minutes later, I was starting to think maybe Vextar was just bluffing. The classroom had settled into this tense, nervous energy where everyone kept glancing at the door like it might explode at any moment. Pipara had actually moved her desk as far from the entrance as possible, which in a standard classroom meant she was practically sitting in the air recycling unit. Then the lights dimmed. Not like someone hit a switch, but that slow, ominous dimming you see in horror movies, right before something with too many teeth shows up to ruin everyone's day. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I swear I could hear this low thrumming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Ah," Vextar said, his voice practically dripping with satisfaction. "She's here." The classroom door didn't open so much as it sort of dissolved. One moment it was there, the next moment there was just this expanding darkness that seemed to eat the light around it. And out of that darkness came something that made every monster movie I'd ever seen look like a children's puppet show. Nyx was magnificent in the way that natural disasters are magnificent. She flowed into the room like living shadow made solid, all rippling muscle and predatory grace. Her main body was roughly the size of a small car, covered in what looked like midnight black scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the tentacles that really sold the whole apex predator thing. She had dozens of them, maybe hundreds, ranging from thick, muscular appendages that could probably crush a steel beam to delicate, finger-like tendrils that moved with disturbing intelligence. Some of them had what looked suspiciously like eyes dotting their length. Others ended in clusters of what I really hoped were just sensory organs and not additional mouths full of teeth. Her head, and I use that term loosely since it seemed to shift and flow like the rest of her, was dominated by a pair of eyes the size of dinner plates that glowed with this eerie, bioluminescent blue light. When she opened what I assumed was her mouth, I counted approximately 17 rows of teeth, each one looking like it had been specifically designed by a committee of sadistic dentists. The effect on my classmates was immediate and dramatic. Morthos, who I'd never seen move faster than a leisurely shuffle, somehow managed to relocate himself to the far corner of the room in about half a second. Zeklin made a sound I'd never heard any creature make before, sort of like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. And Papara? Papara just fainted. Straight up, lights out, hit the floor unconscious. Professor Vextar was eating this up. He stood there next to his pet nightmare like some kind of demented showman, practically glowing with pride and smugness. "Class, allow me to introduce Nyx," he announced, gesturing toward the creature with a flourish. "A fully mature shadow maw from the Grimholt system. As you can observe, she represents the pinnacle of predatory evolution. Notice the adapted tentacle configuration, the enhanced sensory apparatus, and, of course, the natural aura of dominance that causes lesser species to recognize their place in the natural order." While he was talking, Nyx was doing this thing where she sort of swayed from side to side, those dozens of eyes scanning the room like she was taking inventory. Several of her tentacles were tasting the air, and I could see smaller ones exploring the surfaces around her with what looked like curiosity. That's when I made my first mistake. Well, what everyone else would probably call a mistake. I found myself thinking, that's actually pretty cool. It's like a space octopus. See, here's the thing about growing up on a farm. You spend a lot of time around animals, and after a while you start to recognize certain patterns. The way a cow moves when it's curious versus when it's agitated. The difference between a dog that's genuinely aggressive and one that's just posturing. The telltale signs that your grandmother's psychotic rooster is about to make your life miserable for the next 20 minutes. And watching Nyx, I wasn't seeing a mindless killing machine. I was seeing an intelligent creature in an unfamiliar environment, trying to figure out what was going on. Her movements had that careful, exploratory quality that animals get when they're somewhere new and potentially interesting. "The shadow maw," Vextar continued, clearly relishing every word, "is capable of detecting fear through both chemical and electromagnetic means. They are drawn to weakness, as all superior predators are, and they respond to displays of dominance from their intellectual superiors." That's when Nyx turned those massive glowing eyes directly at me. Now I should point out that this was apparently the moment where I was supposed to wet myself in terror and maybe beg for mercy. That was clearly the script Vextar had written in his head. Human student meets apex predator. Human student recognizes his place in the cosmic food chain. Human student gains proper respect for his betters. Instead, I looked back at her and thought, she's got really pretty eyes. I know. Probably not the most survival-oriented response to being stared down by something that could probably use my ribcage as a toothpick. But those eyes weren't filled with malice or hunger, or any of the things you'd expect from a mindless killing machine. They were curious, intelligent, almost friendly. Before I quite realized what I was doing, I found myself leaning forward in my desk to get a better look at her. "Hey there, pretty girl," I said quietly. The entire room went dead silent. Even Vextar stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in what I can only describe as horrified disbelief. Nyx tilted her head, which was impressive considering she didn't seem to have a clearly defined neck. Several of her smaller tentacles stretched toward me, moving with delicate precision. And then, in a voice that somehow managed to sound curious despite coming from a creature that shouldn't have been able to speak at all, she made a soft, trilling sound. Professor Vextar's scales had shifted to a color I'd never seen before, sort of a pale, sickly yellow-green. "Martinez," he hissed, "what do you think you're doing?" I looked up at him with what I hoped was an innocent expression. "Just saying hello, Professor. Isn't that what you're supposed to do when you meet someone new?" That's when Nyx decided to take matters into her own tentacles. What happened next was probably the most surreal 30 seconds of my life, and that's saying something considering I once had to explain to a galactic customs official why I was trying to bring a banjo onto a space station. Nyx moved with surprising grace for something the size of a small shuttle. One moment she was across the room doing her intimidating apex predator routine, and the next moment she was flowing toward my desk like liquid shadow. Her tentacles moved ahead of her, dozens of them reaching out to explore this strange new thing that had dared to speak to her like she was, well, a person. Now I should mention that Professor Vexstar was making some very interesting sounds at this point. Sort of a combination of panic, outrage, and the noise you make when you realize your brilliant plan is about to blow up in your face. He was gesturing frantically and hissing something in what I assumed was his native language, probably the Krillian equivalent of "bad kitty, no eating the students." But Nyx was completely ignoring him. All of her attention was focused on me, and I found myself being examined by what felt like 100 different sensory organs. Tentacles brushed against my arms, my shoulders, even my hair, with surprising gentleness. It was like being investigated by a very thorough, very curious, and very dangerous customs inspection. "Martinez!" Vexstra's voice cracked with panic. "Do not move. Sudden movements will trigger her predatory response." I glanced over at him. "Professor, I hate to break it to you, but I don't think she's in predatory mode. I think she's just curious." To demonstrate my point, I slowly reached out and let one of her smaller tentacles wrap around my finger. It was warm, and covered in what felt like incredibly soft scales. The tentacle squeezed gently, almost like it was shaking hands. "Hello to you too," I said to Nyx. "You're really something, aren't you?" She trilled again, louder this time, and suddenly more tentacles were reaching for me, not grabbing or constraining, just touching, exploring. A few of the ones with eye clusters along their length moved close to my face, and I found myself being stared at by what had to be 24 different eyes, all glowing with that soft blue light. "This is fascinating," I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. "Look at the neural complexity in these appendages. Each one seems to be capable of independent decision-making, but they're all coordinated. It's like she's got distributed intelligence throughout her entire body." That's when Morthos, from his corner of safety, made a grinding sound that I'd learned meant he was asking a question. "How do you know it's not preparing to consume you?" I looked back at Nyx, who had moved even closer and was now using several tentacles to gently examine my hands. Well, for one thing, if she wanted to eat me, I'd probably be digested by now. These tentacles are strong enough to crush steel, but look how carefully she's handling me. And see the way her chromatophores are shifting? Those aren't threat colors. If I had to guess, I'd say she's displaying curiosity patterns. Vexstar was making sounds like a deflating balloon. "Chromatophores? Martinez, how could you possibly know about Shadowmaw color communication?" "Same way you know about anything," I said, gently stroking one of Nyx's larger tentacles. "I read the assigned materials. Your own paper on Grimholt predator behavior was actually pretty informative, once you got past all the academic jargon." This seemed to please Nyx immensely. She made a sound that was almost like purring, if purring was done by something the size of a small building, and then, in a move that I'm pretty sure gave Professor Vexstar a small heart attack, she began to settle herself around my desk. It started gradually. A few tentacles draped over the edges of my desk, then more, creating this sort of living, breathing barrier around my workspace. And finally, with movements that were impossibly graceful for something her size, Nyx arranged herself so that her main body was curled around my chair, with her head resting on my desk close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her bioluminescent eyes. She was, for lack of a better term, cuddling with me. The silence in the classroom was deafening. Pipero had regained consciousness just in time to witness a creature that could theoretically eat our entire solar system settling in for what looked like nap time with the class human. Morthos had gone completely still, which, for a rock-based life form, was saying something. And Zeklin was making rapid calculations on his datapad, probably trying to figure out the statistical probability of what he was witnessing. Professor Vexstar looked like he was having some sort of existential crisis. His scales were cycling through colors I didn't even know existed, and he kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish gasping for air. "This is impossible," he finally managed to croak. "Shadow Maws don't form attachments. They're apex predators. They don't cuddle." I looked up from where I was now, gently scratching behind what I assumed was Nyx's ear. She was making that purring sound again, and several of her tentacles had wrapped loosely around my arms in what was unmistakably an affectionate gesture. "Well," I said, trying to keep a straight face, "maybe they just needed someone to treat them like individuals instead of biological specimens. Animals are surprisingly responsive to basic courtesy." That's when one of Nyx's smaller tentacles reached out and very gently booped Professor Vexstar on the nose. The look on his face was absolutely priceless. Here was this distinguished academic, this expert on dangerous predators, this self-proclaimed superior being getting nose-booped by his own pet nightmare while it cuddled with the human student he'd been trying to intimidate. I couldn't help myself. I started laughing. And that, apparently, was the final straw for Professor Vextar's dignity. What followed was the most spectacular academic meltdown I've ever witnessed, and I once saw a physics professor try to prove string theory using interpretive dance and a rubber chicken. Vextar shrieked, his voice hitting pitches that probably violated several interspecies noise ordinances. "Return to position immediately." Nix, who was still comfortably settled around my desk like the galaxy's deadliest therapy animal, turned one eye toward her supposed master and made a sound that I can only describe as the alien equivalent of meh. Then she went back to enjoying her ear scratches. Vextar's scales had gone full disco ball, cycling through colors so rapidly it was starting to hurt my eyes. "I command you to resume intimidation protocols." This time Nix didn't even bother to look at him. Instead, she shifted positions slightly so she could rest more of her weight against my chair, nearly purring with contentment. A few of her smaller tentacles started playing with my pen, batting it back and forth like a cat with a laser pointer. "Professor," I said gently, trying very hard not to laugh again, "I don't think she's listening to you." "She has to listen to me," Vextar sputtered. "I am her master. I trained her. I domesticated her through superior intellect and advanced behavioral conditioning techniques." That's when Morthos, bless his rocky heart, asked the question we were all thinking. What exactly were these conditioning techniques? Vextar's expression went from outrage to shifty so fast I got whiplash watching it. "Well, that is to say, it's a complex process involving, Professor," Zeklin had recovered enough to join the conversation, "how exactly does one domesticate an apex predator from a death world?" The color cycling stopped abruptly as Vextar's scales settled into what I was learning to recognize as his caught-in-a-lie color palette. I may have simplified the process for academic purposes. Simplified how? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Well, technically speaking, Nix was already. That is to say, she had been previously, by her former caretakers. "She was already tame when you got her," I said. "It wasn't a question." Vextar deflated like a punctured balloon. "She was raised from infancy by a research facility. She's never actually lived in the wild. She's basically, well, a big puppy," I finished for him. As if to emphasize the point, Nix chose that moment to nuzzle against my shoulder with enough force to nearly knock me out of my chair. Her purring had gotten so loud that the desk was starting to vibrate. "This is unacceptable," Vextar wailed. "She's supposed to demonstrate natural hierarchy, predatory dominance, the superiority of advanced species over primitive humans." "Yeah, about that," I said, continuing to pet the galaxy's most dangerous cuddle monster. "I think there might be a flaw in your theory." "Who up flaw?" he demanded. I gestured to Nix, who had now started using one of her tentacles to help organize my notes. "Well, for starters, you're assuming that advanced automatically means better at understanding other species. But humans have been living with animals for thousands of years. We've basically made a career out of figuring out what makes other species tick." "That's ridiculous," Vextar snapped. "Humans are barely evolved primates. You don't even have proper sensory organs." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but we've got something you apparently don't." "And what's that?" I looked down at Nix, who had somehow managed to wrap herself around my chair in such a way that I was basically sitting in a living fortress of tentacles and teeth, all of which were being extremely careful not to hurt me. "We know how to make friends." The silence that followed was broken only by Nix's contented purring and the sound of Pipara's bioluminescent note-taker, which had resumed in rapid, excited bursts. I think she was finally realizing she was witnessing academic history in the making. Vextar stared at us for a long moment, his scales shifting through what I was learning to interpret as various stages of grief. "This is not how this was supposed to go," he said finally, his voice small and defeated. "No," I agreed, "but it's probably better. Look, Professor, you've got an incredibly intelligent social creature here. Instead of trying to use her as a prop for your ego, why don't you actually study her behavior patterns? I bet you'd learn a lot more about predator psychology by watching how she interacts with different species under positive conditions." Nix chose that moment to extend one of her tentacles toward Vextar, not in a threatening way, but in what looked distinctly like an invitation. When he didn't respond, she made a soft, questioning sound. For a moment, I thought he might actually take the hint and try to connect with his own pet, but then his scales hardened back into their usual pompous purple-green, and he drew himself up to his full height. "Class dismissed," he announced curtly. "We will revisit this lesson plan at a later date." As he stalked toward the door, Nix unwrapped herself from around my chair and flowed after him. moving with that same graceful precision. But before she left, she turned back to me and made that soft, trilling sound again, almost like she was saying goodbye. "See you later, pretty girl," I called after her. She paused in the doorway and, I swear on my grandmother's memory, she winked at me with one of her massive eyes before following her grumpy caretaker out into the hallway. The aftermath of what I've come to call the Great Tentacle Incident was, to put it mildly, interesting. For starters, I became something of a celebrity on campus overnight. Word travels fast in academic circles, especially when it involves a professor's carefully planned intimidation tactic backfiring, so spectacularly that security footage of the incident started making rounds as entertainment. Apparently, watching a human turn the galaxy's most feared predator into an oversized lapcat was the kind of content that got shared across 17 different star systems. My fellow students' reactions were mixed, to say the least. Morthos approached me after class with what I had learned to recognize as his version of profound respect, which involved a lot of very serious rock grinding and a formal declaration that I was either the bravest being in the galaxy or the most foolishly suicidal. I chose to take it as a compliment. Zeklin spent 3 days running calculations trying to determine the statistical probability of a human successfully bonding with a shadow maw, eventually concluding that the odds were so astronomical that my survival essentially proved the universe had a sense of humor. Again, I chose to take it as a compliment. Pippera, once she'd gotten over the shock, became absolutely fascinated by the whole incident. She started following me around campus, taking bioluminescent notes about everything I did, convinced that I must possess some kind of secret alien-taming superpower. When I explained that I'd just treated Nyx like I would any other intelligent animal, she spent an entire week trying to figure out how to turn basic courtesy into a peer-reviewed research paper. But the real change was in Professor Vextar himself. The next week, he showed up to class looking like he'd spent several sleepless nights reconsidering his life choices. His usual pompous swagger had been replaced by something that almost looked like humility, and his scales had settled into colors I'd never seen before, sort of muted and thoughtful. "Today," he announced to the class, "we're going to discuss interspecies behavioral dynamics from a more practical perspective." He actually started asking for my input during lectures, not in a condescending way, but like he genuinely wanted to know what I thought about various animal behaviors we were studying. It was weird, but good weird. And Nyx? Well, Nyx started showing up to class regularly. Apparently, after our initial meeting, she'd made it very clear to Vexter that she wanted to attend my xenobiology sessions. How exactly a shadow maw communicates, "I want to go to school," to her caretaker, I'll never know. But knowing Nyx, it probably involved a lot of very polite but extremely persistent tentacle gesturing. She became the class mascot, in a way. During lectures, she'd curl up next to my desk, occasionally offering helpful demonstrations of whatever behavioral pattern we were discussing. When we studied predator hunting techniques, she showed us how her tentacles could move independently. When we covered interspecies communication, she demonstrated her color-changing abilities by cycling through what I'd learned were various emotional states. The other students gradually warmed up to her presence. Morthos discovered that Nyx was actually an excellent study partner, since she could hold multiple textbooks simultaneously while he took notes. Zeklin found that her distributed intelligence made her fascinating to discuss philosophy with, even if the conversations were mostly one-sided. And Pippara, well, Pippara just enjoyed having someone who appreciated her bioluminescent note-taker system. Professor Vextar never quite got over the embarrassment of having his ultimate intimidation tool turn into the class pet, but to his credit, he did start actually studying Nyx's behavior patterns instead of just showing her off. His research improved dramatically once he started treating her as a research partner instead of a prop. As for me, I learned something important about the galaxy we live in. See, everyone assumes that being advanced means being better, smarter, more sophisticated. But sometimes the most advanced thing you can do is remember that intelligence comes in all shapes and sizes, and that making friends is usually more effective than making enemies. Plus, I now had the distinction of being probably the only human in galactic history to have a shadow maw as a study buddy. My mom was so proud when I called home to tell her about it. She said it reminded her of the time I'd convinced Gerald the rooster to let me collect eggs without trying to peck my eyes out. Some skills, apparently, are universal. And if anyone ever doubts that humans belong among the stars, well, I've got a 17-tentacled bioluminescent character witness who's more than happy to vouch for us. She's also surprisingly good at helping with homework, as long as you don't mind your textbooks being organized by someone with several dozen appendages and a tendency to purr. Just another day in the life of the only human dumb enough to major in xenobiology. But hey, at least I've got good study partners.